Okay, when I made my video in the week on atheism, plus I promised a video on feminism and why I'm not a feminist, so this is this video. First, let me say that the title is a little bit perhaps of a misnomer. It's perhaps a little bit misleading because for many people this video will be, pardon me, more along the lines of why I don't label myself as a feminist rather than why I'm not a feminist, because what I believe would come under the umbrella of some people's feminism. But isn't that part of the problem? That the umbrella of what constitutes feminism is so wide that the term is largely meaningless. If you label yourself a feminist, people don't know any more about you than they did before you labelled yourself a feminist, because there's such a wide range of perspectives that fits underneath that label. That's the primary reason why I don't call myself a feminist, because it means putting, rather than just remaining outside of some kind of political position, I'm actually identifying myself with a political position that includes some people whose ideas I find ludicrous, bizarre, and in some cases dangerous. Now, further to that, what some people label as feminism is it's about equality of genders no matter who is discriminated against. And I accept that some people hold that position and label themselves as a feminist on the grounds of holding that position. Now, I can't tell you how a label has to be defined, but what I have to say in terms of using feminism as a label for gender neutrality, that has to be one of the most hypocritical uses of a label I could ever imagine. One of the things that feminism has perhaps brought to us is this understanding that gender-specific terms are not really very appropriate for non-gender specific situations. Perhaps chairman isn't the best term to use anymore. Perhaps we should use chairperson. I'm a firefighter. That's a role that can be occupied by women as well as men. If you went back 20 years ago, they were called firemen. That was changed to firefighter to reflect the fact that both sexes can perform the role. By the way, I'm going to talk solely about men and women here. I know there's all kinds of transgender issues and all this lot, but it's just going to complicate the video. So I apologise. I don't want to upset anybody by leaving them out. I'm just trying to keep it simple, at least in that regard. So I'm going to make it a little bit two-dimensional. So back to this usage of the word. How hypocritical then to use a gender-specific word for the very distillation, the very principle of gender neutrality itself. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And to just say, well, that just demonstrates the historic basis of how the word developed. Maybe it does, but so it does with all these different words. Chairman comes from chairman of the board. You would have a large board in a room. That's why it's called a boardroom. Everybody would sit round the board and the chairman would sit on the chair because you'd have benches either side of the board. That's why a man would sit in the chair by the board. Chairman of the board. That's where the term comes from. That's the historic understanding of that. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't change the term to chairperson. I would suggest to you, if you label yourself a feminist on the grounds that you wish to champion equality, regardless of whether men are on the receiving end or women, I suggest a different term might be appropriate in that instance. Now, let me also state before I go any further that a lot of things that feminists complain about, equality issues pertaining to women, I agree with. There are a lot of inequalities out there and a lot of them are based on people's sex. I accept that, and I think that considerably more often than not, women are on the shitty end of the stick of that. I would contend that that's probably the historical basis for that things have got better, but there are still, things haven't totally improved, have they? A lot of these things have historical basis where there were real inequalities, and although some of them are gradually disappearing, we're still on that slope. We haven't got to where we need to be. Just scratching my foot. But these things still exist, and in the main, it's women that get the shitty end of the stick. Now, some people make the argument, yes, but men get the shitty end of the stick as well. And this is kind of a bit of a discredited position, isn't it? And I think the old men's rights activists have got a lot to be blamed for that, because they'll pick on any pedantic shite. You know, if schoolgirls can wear a skirt and a pair of trousers, and schoolboys can only wear trousers, well, that's just shows, you know, how men are discriminated against. These are petty issues. I'm not interested in petty issues. On all the major issues that count, it's women that are getting the shitty end of the stick, apart from one. But the only problem is that that one is probably the most important issue of the lot, or at least it is if you're a parent. If you're a parent, nothing is more important to you, I would contend, than your children. Not your job, not whether your MP's male or female, not whether you have equal chance of a good career in the army. The most important thing to you is your children. And it is absolutely true that in the UK, at least, fathers are seen as second-class parents, not just by the population at large, though they certainly are by the population at large, but by the government. It's the only example of state-condoned sexism that I actually know. Divorce courts divvy up children based on the principle, the stated principle, that if the children are too young to have a say, if it's young children, the presumption is they are better off with the mother. This isn't a case of they assess a mother and assess a father, decide which one's best, and that on average they find that kids are better off with the mother. In fact, I would expect that to be the case. I think on average, probably, especially with young children, motherhood does trump fatherhood. And so if we wished to treat people according to the groups to which they belong, if we wished to stereotype people in this way, then yes, motherhood does trump fatherhood. But surely the principle is that we don't do that. Surely the principle is we judge people as individuals, the same as when people apply to join the fire service. On average, more men are going to have the physical skills, at least, necessary to get in than women. But we don't judge people as male applicants and female applicants. We just judge them as applicants. So women generally, I would contend, get the shitty end of the stick. But on that one particular example, and that's not one that you can just wave away as trivial, it's far from trivial, men get the shitty end of the stick. I might return to that in a little bit, along with a few other things, because what I want to talk about now, there's lots of concepts that feminists embrace that I don't like. Not all feminists, but a lot of them. And these are part of the things that stop me from adopting the term. So rather than go through them all, I'm just going to major on one, and that's going to be the patriarchy. Okay, so first let me say that I broadly agree with the argument that we live in a patriarchal society. Patriarchy, I think, means that most of the status positions are held by men. The captains of industry are men. There's more female representatives in parliament than there are female. World leaders are overwhelmingly male, etc., etc., etc. Those status positions are held by men. Men hold the whip hand in those roles. Of course, there's a sort of underlying assumption there that they're acting as men for the interests of men. That's something that you would need to demonstrate rather than just assume. The overwhelming number of world leaders have dark hair, but that doesn't mean they're acting in the interests of people with dark hair, and nobody assumes that it does. Perhaps we have more reason to assume that men would act in the interests of men, or create a more male-friendly culture from those positions of power than we would with hair colour. But it's still, I think, something that you cannot just assume. But I do accept the basic principle that we live in a patriarchy. I also accept, as I've already said, that there are inequalities and that a lot of the time women are at the shitty end of the stick with regard to those inequalities. What I do not accept is that there's always a link between one and the other. And yet the link always seems to be made, doesn't it? With regard to the example that I gave there with men being treated as second-class parents, I've heard that made that, well, that's actually the patriarchy, and if you solve the patriarchy, that'll go. What it's about is, it's about keeping women in their place. If you have a divorce and you've got children, the woman gets the children, so she's busy looking after the children while the man can plough on with his career. Of course, that kind of forgets about the fact that the woman's got children because she wanted the children. You know, however much the man wanted the children, he's got fuck all to do. If she wants the children, she's got them. It's not like they've been foisted or forced on her in any kind of a way. But that's beside the point. The point is that I think up to about the 50s, the situation was reversed in the UK. That basically, if the man wanted the children, he got them on the grounds that, well, he's a man. And that was attributed to the patriarchy as well. And I actually have more sympathy that that probably was as a result of patriarchal society. But this is the first problem, is that you can attribute anything to the patriarchy. If you can attribute placing fatherhood ahead of motherhood as attributable to the patriarchy and attributing motherhood ahead of fatherhood as attributable to a patriarchy, then what kind of a shite argument is it to attribute stuff to the patriarchy? It's like I stand on top of a wall and there's a man and a woman below me. You can make a good argument, whichever one I help up, that it's patriarchal behaviour. If I lift up the man, it's patriarchal because it's men helping men. If I lift up the woman, then I'm being kind of overbearing and fatherly and assuming the woman needs help and the man can quite happily scale the wall on his own efforts. So that's certainly an initial concern of mine. If you can attribute a situation to the patriarchy and attribute the exact opposite situation to the patriarchy, that kind of sets alarm bells ringing for me. Look, what I want to do, I've already accepted there's a lot of inequalities. Most of them are aimed at women. What I don't accept is that the patriarchy or our patriarchal society is responsible for them. I also don't think that the patriarchal society is necessarily something that we can get away from. I'll explain that. I'll explain both of those with a couple of thought experiments. And I apologise for them being thought experiments, but they're not experiments, however much resources I had that I could actually carry out. So I ask you to journey with me on these thought experiments and see if you agree with what I have to say. If you don't, then you can tell me where you think I'm wrong, how you think things would be different. So the first thing I want you to consider is that we don't live in a patriarchal society, that we live in a matriarchal society, where most of the positions of status were occupied by women. If that was the case, what would you expect to see different? Would you expect to see most people in frontline positions in the military occupied by women? Would you expect to see fathers as first-rate parents and women sort of pushed down the list as second-class parents? If we lived in a matriarchy, wouldn't it still be women that fell pregnant? Wouldn't women still bear children inside them for 9 months? Wouldn't they still be the ones that had titties that milk comes out of, that allows them to breastfeed? Wouldn't they still be the ones that more often than not, although we should judge people as individuals on a statistical level, they probably would be the better parents for younger children? Wouldn't we still have a lot of these inequalities? Wouldn't women still have more time outside of the workplace on account of the fact that they fall pregnant, that they have children, that they nurture young children? And as soon as you fall out of that workplace, you're always slightly, everything else is equal, you're always slightly behind by however many months you've been out of the workplace, behind somebody who doesn't have children. So wouldn't a lot of these inequalities be exactly the same in a matriarchy as they would be in a patriarchy? Wouldn't men's predispositions still be the same in a matriarchy as they are in a patriarchy? Do we really think that the only reason that men are more aggressive than women is because men hold positions of status? Do we really think the reason that men are physically stronger than women are because men hold positions of status? I would suggest to you that a lot of these inequalities would still exist. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't address them, because a lot of these inequalities exist because of predispositions we hold or characteristics we hold that we can now work round. We don't have to foster to that anymore. In military forces, as technology becomes more and more important, the physical characteristics that men possessed for a lot more roles aren't significant anymore, so that a man or a woman can do those roles. So we accept that. But that isn't a symptom of patriarchy or matriarchy. It's irrelevant to that. It's the characteristics that separate, that make different men from women. So that's the first thought experiment. What about the second? Okay. This is what I want you to entertain here, because this is, I want to look at the very concept of the patriarchy and men being in the position of status, and implying by that in some ways that isn't a natural order of things, or there's some way round that. This is perhaps going to be the most controversial part of this video, but bear with me. This is what I want to do in this experiment, okay? What I'm going to do is, all the captains of industry, all the top people in the world, all the movers and shakers, all the world leaders, their sex is going to be reversed. If they're male, they're going to be female. If they're female, it's going to be male. God knows what Michelle Obama's going to think when Barack comes home and he's a woman. But it's going to, let's just forget about those kind of bits. Okay, let's assume that nobody notices any of that. Okay, so we're going to totally alter all of that. Okay, and effectively make it a matriarchy again. We're also going to alter everybody's perception. Let's make everybody kind of gender neutral. And every job where there's more men than women will equalise it. There'll be as many women in the military, there'll be as many women firefighters as men, there'll be as many male nurses as female nurses, there'll be as many male midwives as female midwives. We're going to equal everything. What do we think would happen? Are we asserting that that's going to continue? That if we come back in 200 years' time it will still be exactly the same? Because it's only culture that defines what we are. That despite the fact that in every other primate out there there are genetic predispositions that differentiate the male and the female, that really isn't the case in human beings, that we come out of the womb an entirely blank slate and it's only culture that fosters these differences. I would suggest to you that it is not the case. If we came back in 200 years' time, and here's my contentious bit, that the situation would have reversed. We started off with a situation where most of the world leaders were female. I contend that in 200 years' time we'd be back pretty much where we are now. Perhaps not to quite the same degree, because I think things are shifting anyway. But I contend to you we would be back at a situation where the majority of captains of industry and the majority of world leaders would be male. The reason I make that claim is because I think there is more at stake for men to go for positions of status. You can make an evolutionary argument on that, on breeding grounds. I don't think I'm going to go through all of that at the moment. Genghis Khan made the argument pretty well with the number of children that he managed to sire. I think that the variation in reproductive success of males is potentially much greater than that of females. I want to make a case that Frans de Waal makes, the noted primatologist. I read a book of his a couple of years ago and he was talking about working with chimps. And as an aside, this is the side on his part, this is fundamental to what I'm saying. He said, you may have wondered why every experiment I'm talking about chimps, I'm talking about female chimps. And there is a problem working with female chimps, he said, is that female chimps are really concerned about the baby chimps, the little chimps, the chimpettes or chimplets, or I don't know what they're called. Chimplet sounds quite good, doesn't it? Quite, that sounds chimplet. They're concerned about the baby chimps, which kind of distracts them from the experiment, and you've got to entertain that. That female chimps look after, nurture young chimps, and so that's a distraction. But he said it's nothing of a distraction compared to if you try and work with male chimps. Working with male chimps is pretty much a non-starter right from the word go. Why? Well, according to Frans de Waal, is because the male chimps are so utterly concerned with status that as soon as you separate a male chimp from all the other chimps to conduct the experiment or to work with a chimp, the male chimp is obsessed with what is happening elsewhere. He's obsessed that other male chimps are up to business, that they're not there to protect and improve their social status, and with it the reproductive rights that go with it. Now, if that is true of chimps, how can we categorically say that there isn't some predisposition in human beings that makes men more desperate to attain status than women, that they will take more risks, that they are happier to tread on everybody else, to shit on everybody else in an effort to promote themselves above everybody else? And in doing so, that might well be that men fuck up more often and end up at the bottom of the pile, which might be part of why there are more men in prison, more men as tramps and vagabonds, not vagabonds, tramps walking the streets, homeless, but also why the majority of people in those high status positions are males, because on average Statistically speaking, not talking about individuals, statistically speaking, more men are interested in throwing everything they've got into achieving a position of status than women. And if that is the case and everything else being equal, wouldn't you expect more men to be in positions of status? In other words, the only way not to have a patriarchy would be to actively stop it from happening. The number of people who may be interested in being a particular status position, you would actually have to say, well, there are more men interested in this than women, therefore on average you would expect the best candidate to be a male, but bollocks to it, we're not going to look for the best candidates, we're going to accept that we're not going to have the best candidate to try and rig the system in some kind of way. Now, I'm not into rigging systems. What I'm interested in, and this is where I deviate from some feminists seem to think that we need to treat people as individuals, but they keep harking back to looking at people as groups and their successors groups. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in treating people as individuals. I have two fundamental principles that I work to. The first is that I believe in the principle of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. I couldn't really give a crap about equality of outcome. I'm solely interested that everybody has the same opportunity. That doesn't mean that I don't want to provide support structures for those that don't make it. I do. I believe in a welfare state. I'm a firm proponent of that. But I believe in equality of opportunity. The second thing, the principle that undergirds almost everything that I believe, is that I believe that people should be judged as individuals on their merits and demerits, and not according to the average characteristics of some group to which they belong. So we don't judge candidates as female candidates and male candidates, we judge them as candidates. And if as the end result of that, way down the line, we end up with far more men than women doing something, or far more women than men doing something, then so be it. We've judged people as individuals, we've given everybody a fair crack as individuals. I don't see that you can do far better than that. Notwithstanding that, by the way, when it comes to representation in the Parliament, I think there is something to be said for everybody having some kind of representation. So maybe there's some worth in setting minimum levels of representation, that at least 20% of members of Parliament in the UK should be male, or at least 20% should be female, whichever way. It shouldn't drop below a certain threshold level, perhaps, just so that large percentage of the population are represented. But other than that, why don't we just treat people as individuals, let them rise and fall as individuals, and not treat them or label them according to their sex? Okay, well, that's pretty much all I want to say about feminism. I hope that's explained to you some of the issues that I have with feminism, some of the ways in which my views certainly overlap with a lot of people who would label themselves as feminists. I would hope that most people would see that my views are quite reasonable. I'm certainly not looking to discriminate against anybody, but I'm not trying to start from some untenable political position that everybody is identical, or that everything can be attributed to cultural factors. I don't think that's tenable. I don't think that is the case. Okay, well, I was going to add one little extra bit about this slightly different topic at the end, but I'm not going to do that. You've listened to me for long enough. Thank you for watching this video. I'm sure there's people that will disagree with me. That's absolutely fine. I have no problem about that. Let me know what it is you disagree with. Make a video, make your comments. Thanks for watching this video, and bye for now.